Once a pollen grain lands on the compatible stigma, it starts germinating. This is marked by the growth of a pollen tube down the length of the style. The pollen tube carries the male gametes towards the embryo sac. As the male gamete approaches the embryo sac, its nucleus divides in two. And as the pollen tube reaches the ovule, the polar nuclei in the female gametophyte fuse into one diploid nucleus. The pollen tube bursts and releases the two male gametes into the cytoplasm of the synergid. Contents of the pollen tube are released in one of the synergids, and as the egg cell and synergids are in close contact, sperms do not have to travel a long distance. The sperms exhibit amoeboid movement. One of the male gametes move towards the egg and the other to the polar nuclei. Only one of the two sperms fuses with the egg, resulting in syngamy or true fertilization, which leads to the formation of a diploid zygote. The second male gamete fuses with the haploid polar nuclei to form a triploid cell, technically called the primary endosperm nucleus, or PEN for short. As three haploid nuclei are involved in this fusion, this process is also termed triple fusion. These more or less simultaneous events, that is syngamy and triple fusion, are collectively termed double fertilization. And they're a hallmark of angiosperm reproduction. Fertilization in flowering plants accomplishes two things. One, it creates a diploid zygote, which develops into an embryo. And two, it creates a triploid cell, that is the PEN, which eventually develops into endosperm, a nutrient-rich tissue that supplies energy to a plant embryo during its development. Densely packed cells in the tissue around the ovule form the tough seed coat, an outer layer that protects the developing embryo from water loss and other damage. While the ovule develops into a seed, the walls of the ovary develop into a fruit, another structure that distinguishes angiosperms.
Even in the Sahara, rain does sometimes fall, and that is sufficient for plants to survive, providing they have the right adaptations. Rising from the sand, a dried-out ball of twigs. In strong winds, it could travel. This plant may have been dead for 100 years. Yet its name suggests that all is not lost. For this is a resurrection plant. Around here, rain might only fall once or twice a year. But if you're searching for decades, that might be enough. Dead limbs absorb water and unfurl in a matter of minutes. But the resurrection plant needs one more miracle. Rain must fall on its branches before they dry out and close up again. Within hours, shoots emerge. In just a few weeks, they flower and develop seeds of their own. Then, before they can grow any larger, the sun kills them.
Like all living things, plants reproduce to ensure future generations. But since plants can't move from place to place, they need a way to transfer pollen from one plant to another. Wind is a major pollinator, but it acts unselectively. Insects, on the other hand, pollinate flowers with precision. The bright colors and strong fragrances of flowers attract insects. Once lured to the flowers, insects discover pollen and nectar. Bees, butterflies, and other insects gather pollen and nectar to feed themselves and their young. As insects move from plant to plant, they transfer pollen from one flower to the next. Fertilization occurs and seeds are formed. Over time, flowers have developed colors, smells, and shapes that successfully entice insects. At the same time, insects have developed features and behaviors that make them more effective pollinators.
Can plants talk to each other? It certainly doesn't seem that way. Plants don't have complex sensory or nervous systems like animals do, and they look pretty passive, basking in the sun and responding instinctively to inputs like light and water. But odd as it sounds, plants can communicate with each other. Just like animals, plants produce all kinds of chemical signals in response to their environments, and they can share those signals with each other, especially when they're under attack. These signals take two routes, through the air and through the soil. When plant leaves get damaged, whether by hungry insects or an invading lawnmower, they release plumes of volatile chemicals. They're what's responsible for the smell of freshly cut grass. Certain kinds of plants like sagebrush and lima beans are able to pick up on those airborne messages and adjust their own internal chemistry accordingly. In one experiment, sagebrush leaves were deliberately damaged by insects or scissor-wielding scientists. Throughout the summer, other branches on the same sagebrush plant got eaten less by insects wandering through, and so did branches on neighboring bushes, suggesting that they had beefed up their anti-insect defenses. Even moving the air from above a clipped plant to another one made the second plant more insect-resistant. These airborne cues increased the likelihood of seedling survival and made adult plants produce more new branches and flowers. But why would a plant warn its neighbors of danger, especially if they're competing for resources? Well, it might be an accidental consequence of a self-defense mechanism. Plants can't move information through their bodies as easily as we can, especially if water is scarce. So plants may rely on those airborne chemicals to get messages from one part of the plant to another. Nearby plants can eavesdrop on those signals, like overhearing your neighbor sneeze and stocking up on cold medicine. Different plants convey those warnings using different chemical languages. Individual sagebrush plants in the same meadow release slightly different sets of alarm chemicals. The makeup of that cocktail influences the effectiveness of communication. The more similar two plants' chemical fingerprints are, the more fluently they can communicate. A plant will be most sensitive to the cues emitted by its own leaves. But because these chemicals seem to be inherited, like human blood types, sagebrush plants communicate more effectively with relatives than with strangers. But sometimes even other species can benefit. Tomato and tobacco plants can both decipher sagebrush warning signals. Plants don't have to rely solely on those airborne broadcasts. Signals can travel below the soil surface too. Most plants have a symbiotic relationship with fungi, which colonize the plant's roots and help them absorb water and nutrients. These fungal filaments form extensive networks that can connect separate plants, creating an underground superhighway for chemical messages. When a tomato plant responds to blight by activating disease-fighting genes and enzymes, signaling molecules produced by its immune system can travel to a healthy plant and prompt it to turn on its immune system too. These advanced warnings increase the plant's chance of survival. Bean plants also eavesdrop on each other's health through these fungal conduits. An aphid infestation in one plant triggers its neighbor to ramp up production of compounds that repel aphids and attract aphid-eating wasps. If you think of communication as an exchange of information, then plants seem to be active communicators. They're sending, receiving, and responding to signals without making a sound, and without brains, noses, dictionaries, or the internet. And if we can learn to speak to them on their terms, we may gain a powerful new tool to protect crops and other valuable species. It all makes you wonder, what else are we missing?
With springtime upon us, the sound of a weekend mower and the pleasant smell of fresh-cut grass is finally back. But of course, smell's entirely subjective. What we perceive as a wonderful whiff of springtime may actually be a chemical cry for help. It's a tough world out there for a plant. It's easy to get walked all over or eaten alive. And because plants can't, well, move, they were forced to evolve a complex system of self-defense. So let's be real here, folks. How many of you out there knew that plants can communicate with each other? Grass isn't alone. Communication is common throughout the plant kingdom, although it's really complex and not fully understood. For the most part, it centers around specialized organic volatile compounds that have really intense odors. Green plants have a very distinct kind of leafy smell to them, which is a result of volatile organic compounds such as alcohols, esters, and aldehydes that they and many other plants emit into the air. It's just their natural smell. But when damaged, plants have been found to produce huge amounts of a group of molecules that plant chemistry specialists call green leaf volatiles. When a leaf like a blade of grass is broken or ruptured, it causes a special enzyme called lipoxygenase to begin the breakdown of membranes in the plant cells, producing linoleic and linolenic acids. These acids, which are exposed to oxygen from the damage done, are further broken down by another enzyme into a very potent to our nose molecule called Z3-hexanal. Then it quickly breaks down into Z3-hexanol, known as leaf alcohol, and E2-hexanal, known as leaf aldehyde. This molecule soup, along with some other similarly sized molecules, is the green odor of plants. Our noses can detect the intermediate aldehyde, Z3-hexanol, in amounts as low as 0.25 parts per billion in the air, meaning this is the most likely culprit for that freshly cut grass smell that we know. So why do plants produce and give off all these chemicals? There's some evidence that these chemicals are signals to neighboring plants that danger is imminent. This allows the plants to prepare their defenses. It might also be that large plants warn other parts of themselves, depending on how far these volatile cues travel. A molecule called jasmonic acid is another way that plants activate their defenses. Plant scientists believe this chemical might spark changes in what biomolecules the plants make to help it cope with potential damage or make other parts of itself less nutritious. Another way plants seem to defend themselves is by communicating with bugs. Basically, they call out to the pests of their pests. One study looked at the caterpillar Menduga sexta chowing down on some tobacco plants. All that leaf chewing released green leaf volatiles, but not just the usual ones we've already talked about. The specific bouquet of green leaf volatiles attracted big-eyed bugs that love to eat these caterpillars. Plant wisdom here, folks. The enemy of your enemy is really your friend. Lastly, other mixtures of these green leaf volatiles are effective antimicrobial agents. More than one study suggests that leaf aldehyde fights botrytis, the fungus that plagues wine grapes. We're still in the very early stages of understanding plant communication, but what we've discovered so far is pretty cool. For those of you who love the smell of fresh cut grass, we hope we haven't made you feel bad for loving the smell of suffering plants. But just like that strange smell of rain in the spring, the smells around us can be a product of fascinating, purposeful chemistry in nature. Thanks for watching. Let us know any mysteries of nature you want us to cover in the comments. See you next time.
point of dispersal is the wind. Seeds of plants like dandelions have parachute-like or hair-like structures attached that are so light in weight that they easily get carried away by the wind. Thus, even the seeds get carried to distant places.
Many plants are pollinated by the wind and do not require the help of animal pollinators. Grasses, for example, as well as important food crops that were bred from wild grasses like wheat and maize, are all wind-pollinated, as are the flowers of many common trees, such as willows, birches, walnuts, and hazelnuts. The flowers of plants that are animal-pollinated employ many devices to attract pollinators. These frequently include large petals and sepals in a fantastic variety of shapes and colors, as well as sweet nectar, and enticing fragrances too. The flowers of wind-pollinated plants, however, are quite different. Since they have no need to attract pollinators, they usually lack large petals and sepals, don't produce much nectar, and they are rarely very fragrant. Wind-pollinated flowers often have exposed stamens, so that the pollen they produce has easy access to wind currents, and they may have large and feathery stigmas and styles as well, to easily trap the wind-blown pollen grains, as is the case with the silk of female maize flowers seen here. And although they don't make flowers, almost all gymnosperms, conifer trees such as firs and pines, are wind-pollinated too. Their seeds develop on the surface of the scales of the female cones, while their pollen is produced by the male cones. As is true of conifers and almost all other wind-pollinated plants, pollen is produced in very large quantities, and the grains are very light, so that they can be easily transported by the wind.
In this video, time goes by very fast, so you can watch a seed grow into a big pine tree. The seeds inside the pine cone are ripe. It's time for the pine cone to open. Seeds fly through the air and land softly on the earth. Pine cones fall to the ground too. Here is one seed. Watch it take root and begin to grow.
wheat bread and white bread? Well, it partially depends on how it's milled. To make white bread, wheat is usually passed through steel roller mills. These remove the grain's outer shell, the bran, as well as the germ at the center. What's left is the endosperm. The nutrients in wheat grain are mainly found in the bran and the germ, the very parts removed in commercial milling. So that's what white bread is. Wheat with basically all the good stuff taken out. If you buy stone ground, multi-grain, or wheat bread, that doesn't necessarily mean you're getting bread with the whole grain in it either. In fact, there is no certification or USDA regulation that explains exactly what's going into your bread. In the end, if consumers want all the nutrition of whole wheats and grains, they'll need to read some labels and learn what's in the food they eat. And farmers will have to do their part too. In some parts of the country, farmers are growing identity-preserved grains. Grains that tell a story of what you're eating, how it was grown, and where. Other farmers are reintroducing grains remembered from their childhoods. Landrace wheats that disappeared from many parts of this country years ago. Carefully tended by special artisanal mills, these grains have names like Turkey Red Winter Wheat, which bakers have rediscovered and put to use, creating products with a rich history, one built on community and a place where you can know your baker and the bread he bakes.